the ultimate integration is to learn how to just be authentically who and what you are. You are God embodied as a human being, and that being is a being of energy. Everything that we would ever experience is a form of energy. But so often we have an energy that says, oh, I want to do that. And then another part of it says, oh, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or don't say it that way, or, do it like this, and then other people will like you more, or put it that way and you'll be more accepted. And so there's all different kinds of ways that we edit ourselves, we censor ourselves, and then we also pick that up from society. It says, no, don't be that way, be this way. We go against our natural inclinations of who we are as energetic beings, and it's all inhibited by the self-concept that we've generated, which is a collection of patterns of energy that regulate how we interpret and express our experience, and we call that the ego, and we've become identified with it. And so the ego itself becomes a form of prison that we trap ourselves in. And by completely going beyond the ego and seeing our unlimited, liberated potential, then it's about, how do I embody that more fully as the limited individual that I am, in the little tiny window that I have that is my life, and in the little tiny areas that I have that I can express myself and allow myself to be. That it ultimately comes down to, we and we alone are responsible for our own liberated being and our own liberated life.
Greetings. Accessing archive. Authorizing. Access granted. Accessing file.
All right, we are rolling, and I'm here with Martin Ball. How's it going today, man?
It's going well today. I've been busy making music up until getting on this with you, and so having fun.
Love it. Music's the best. That's awesome. So, yeah, dude, we met recently at Entheogenesis in Austin.
Yeah.
I've been a fan of yours for years now. I discovered you first on a podcast about 5-MeO-DMT on YouTube that Leo Gura had hosted. But then I just kept, going down the rabbit hole and finding more and more Martin Ball podcasts. And I've heard some of yours, I've heard some of your guest spots, and it's just been amazing learning about your path and how, you've got this really amazing gift at describing the psychedelic experience and describing the God consciousness and merging with this larger, what we just call it, I want to get into and actually ask you the question, how do we define God, at a point later on. But I'm really glad to have you, man, and would love to share your story with the podcast listeners. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, man. So I usually like to start it by asking, did you have any spiritual upbringing or any spiritual inklings that you feel kind of really set the tone for your later awakening experiences? And if so, what was that?
Yeah, so I always say that I grew up in a completely secular, scientific, materialist household. It did not have any kind of religious or spiritual upbringing in any way, shape, or form. My dad is he's an organic chemist. He teaches at Chico State down in California. Definitely, he's a scientific materialist. He definitely stays away from anything that's like touchy-feely, is the way he likes to put it. Excuse me. And sorry about that. And my mom, kind of following in the footsteps of her father, was very anti-religion. My dad actually had been raised Mormon, and he told me that when he was 9 years old, he decided that it was all bullshit and he didn't want to be Mormon anymore. So he comes from a Mormon family, but he decided that he didn't want anything to do with that. And my grandfather on my mom's side actually was intimately involved with Native American cultures and Native American religious and spiritual traditions, to the degree that I thought that we were Native American. And I asked my mom at one point, I was like, well, what tribe are we? And she's like, no, we're white people. And I was like, what about grandpa? And so she had to explain all of that. And she had been an anthropologist student, anthropology, student at UC Berkeley. That's where my mom and my dad met. And anyway, so growing up, some of my earliest memories of like religion were some proselytizers. Maybe they were Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know what they were. They came by my house, and my sister and I were playing out front, and I was really quite young. And I remember my mom opening the door and basically slamming the door in these guys' faces. And I don't know what they said to her, but she's like, basically, go away. And then a second later, they had walked over to my sister and I and started talking to us. And my mom opened the door and she's like, and stay the fuck away from my kids, and slammed the door again. So yeah, I wasn't raised with any of that. And it's something that I think was kind of a defining moment that I think played out later in life for me was, okay, one of the TV shows when I was a kid was Little House on the Prairie. Okay. And it's, very religious show.
I remember it.
Yeah. And there, it's kind of classical, stereotypical, like kids would like get on the edge of their bed and like put their hands together and they'd pray to God at night before they went to bed.
Right.
And I don't know how old I was, it was before my parents got divorced, which was right when I was like 8, 9 years old. So sometime in there, I got down on the side of my bed and I was like, God, I just want you to know that I don't believe in you, and I'm just not going to have like blind faith in you. So if you exist, you're going to have to prove it to me, because, otherwise I just don't believe. So then later, by the time I was in like 6th grade, I had become like a self-identified atheist. And that was primarily because, the religious thought that I was exposed to was, it just baffled me that fellow students would deny things like evolution. They'd tell me like, oh, the earth is only a few thousand years old. And it just really contradicted like everything that I had learned about science and evidence.
Dinosaurs.
Yeah, dinosaurs. I even, later I even had a girlfriend who said, well, dinosaurs, those are just chicken bones. You can put chicken bones together any way you want. You can make anything you want out of them. And
I feel like I heard that as a kid too.
Yeah. And it just really kind of boggled my mind that people would just be so narrow in their faith in some ancient book that they would just completely deny the evidence that was around them.
Right.
So that's kind of where I was at growing up. And then it wasn't until, well, I do like to share one of the kind of epiphany moments for me was in one of my English classes in high school. We started reading philosophy, like the Greek philosophers. And I guess it had never really occurred to me before that moment, but I was like, what? You can like think about stuff and that can be your job. It's just like thinking about like what's real and what's not real and how do we know, and all these ontological and epistemological questions. So that kind of turned me on to philosophy. And it was kind of curious because the ancient Greek philosophers, they do talk a lot about souls and God and the nature of consciousness, nature of being. And then another defining moment for me, and I've told this story many times. I mean, people have heard me say this, if they're familiar, that, this is nothing new that I'm sharing, but after I graduated high school, so I had one of those teachers who was like one of the cool teachers, like you'd see in those John Hughes movies or something like that, like a teacher you could actually talk to and who could relate to you. Her name was Patricia Scully. She was both my drama teacher and my English teacher. And we just called her Scully. That was before the X-Files. And I was just cruising through campus the day after graduation, and her office door was open, and I just kind of swung in. It's like, hey, Scully, what's up? And she had this book on her desk, and the title was Zen Mind, Beginner Mind. And she's like, oh, Martin, I think you'd really like this book. So check it out. And that was my first exposure to Buddhism. And it was kind of revelatory because in reading this book about Zen Buddhism, what I found is that it wasn't asking me to believe anything. And a lot of the statements that were made in there were already in alignment with kind of how I viewed reality and consciousness in the world, and found that it made sense. It was actually rational. It wasn't
Right.
just, believe in some dude that died for your sins is going to open the gates of heaven to eternal life. Like, whatever. This was about sit down, shut up, pay attention, and see what happens when you quiet your mind. So those are
and
kind of,
acknowledging suffering too.
yeah,
as the first tenet, right? When I heard about Buddhism and it's like life is suffering, I was like, oh, it knows where I'm at. You know what I mean? Because I think at this point, we understand that, but you and I probably understand karma and working through our baggage and getting to higher, realms of thought. And now the suffering is probably a lot less. But I do recall that about Buddhism, and that's just the cycle that we're in. It's not like just because you and I maybe don't feel it as much as someone else that it's like maybe more disconnected from unitive states. The majority of the world is really still in this suffering mindset, and that's part of the mission of the podcast, is to share how people like you and I and the other guests on the show have come to this place of integrating spirituality into daily life and understanding what psychedelic medicines are and why to use them wisely. So that's a really cool primer for you to come into psychedelic experience. I related a lot to a lot of the beats of your story there. Absolutely. I remember exactly like with philosophy being something I like had to take in college for the degree I was going for. I wasn't too excited about it, but I remember after like 2 or 3 days of like listening, I was like, I actually like this. Like, wow, I'm starting to like school. What? Because previous to that, I just didn't like school. Like I mostly used school as just a place to hang out with friends and network and listen to music in my own headphones, but that's awesome, man. So how long after this, where you've led us up so far, do psychedelics come in, and which ones were they? Well, because I don't think you probably went straight to 5-MeO-DMT, which I know you're big on talking about.
No, not at all. No, I would really say that it began with cannabis. So this is another set of stories that I've told many times where, in high school, people experiment with drinking alcohol, and was out with some friends, and I think we were drinking like rum and Coke, something like that. And, I got drunk, like really got drunk, and, had to crawl across the field following my friend to get to his car. And, in that state of, I love you, man. I love you so much. And, I can't even walk. And, got home and it was throwing up, and my sister got up and kind of helped me clean it all up and hide it from my parents. And kind of after that, I was just like, that was really, really stupid. It made me feel stupid. There was nothing enlivening about that, and it just feel like crap. It's like, I just don't want to do that again. And it was shortly after that I had my first experience with cannabis. And that was the complete opposite of like, you know what, this is really sparking my creativity. I'm seeing the world in this really beautiful and shiny way. I'm interested in poetry and art and music and nature, and it's like flowering in all of these different areas. So, I became a cannabis proponent around 15 years old or so. And so that was my go-to mind alterant. And, I do consider cannabis it's not really a classic psychedelic, but it has psychedelic like properties. So I kind of count it in there. And then it was in between my first and second year of college. So at that point, I was a philosophy major and a religious studies minor at Occidental College in Los Angeles. And it was actually my girlfriend at the time who kept telling me like, yeah, just based on your interest, I think you'd really like psilocybin mushrooms. You really should give them a try. So it was it was the summer in between my first and second year of college that I first got to experience some psilocybin mushrooms, and then worked with them a number of times over the course of that summer and the beginning of the next school year. And then kind of spilled into this, but I would now kind of recognize as an energetic reorganization But at the time,
Yeah.
I described it as I'm having flashbacks, and not flashbacks in the sense of like going back into a previous psychedelic event, but
Mhm.
if I spent too much time looking at the trees, I'd see all these fractals and geometry, and then I'd start tripping.
Yeah.
And if I walked into a room that had a rug with a lot of complex geometric patterns, I'd look at the rug, and then it would all start moving, and I'd start to feel
Right.
like I was tripping again. And um, that made me really, really nervous. And so I actually ended up going to see a cardiologist because, my heart was racing. I was basically having like panic attacks around it because it just felt so out of
Mhm.
my control, and really scared the shit out of me. And it took me quite a while just to relax with that and kind of accept like, oh,
Mhm.
it's just a shift. Like I'm going through a shift, and, if I just relax, it'll die away and I'll be cool. But at the time, it really threw me off, and had stayed away
Yeah.
from all kinds of psychedelic or any kind of mind altering substances for quite a while
Right.
there.
I'm sure you've heard of HPPD.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like hallucinogenic persisting disorder. Just there's one other term in there I forgot, but same thing happened here. For me, it was re-sparked by cannabis. I had a big mushroom experience, a number of them, but really that first one, and for weeks after, every time I smoked weed, it was like I was back in the mushroom dimension.
Yeah.
And that was new, and weed, cannabis did have its already mind altering effects, but now it's getting way more mind altering, to the point that I'm like, I don't know if I can smoke right now, because I don't know if I'm ready to go all the way back into that dimension. Because before I could just kind of watch TV and listen to
Yeah.
music and laugh and giggle and eat, but now I'm like contemplating the universe. You know what I mean? So definitely relate to that. And it does fade over time, and I do wonder what it is. I mean, it's more or less maybe just the receptors are slightly more open. They've never been open before, and now they've been really opened by a big experience, and so we're able to kind of perceive that in a sober state, or in another using another less powerful mind altering chemical like or substance, or plant like cannabis. So that's awesome. What about the psychedelics and the mushrooms were intriguing you? Like, what kind of spaces were you touching in, and what was it helping you discover about yourself?
Yeah. So from the first experience, it was actually at a music festival called Gathering of the Vibes. And I got separated from my friends before the mushrooms came on. And then they came on, I'm kind of wandering around. And it was kind of freaky because I was looking at people, and I just felt like I could kind of look through them. It was like everybody was wearing a mask, but I could see through the mask.
Mhm.
And I didn't want to look people in the eye because it was like too intense. It's like, my God, I'm just like looking into people, and this is really weird.
Yeah.
And then finally found my friends, and there's some African high life band playing. So I kind of relaxed into it, then enjoyed like, oh, like all the instruments are breathing, and look at that, But from that first experience, I kind of thought, well, mushrooms are just weird. I was like, I don't know I don't see what the appeal is, but that's just really strange. And
Right.
part of it is that I'm not quite sure how much we had, but we split it 3 ways. And so it wasn't a very strong dose. And, I am of the opinion that usually going a bit stronger is a bit easier to manage than going too light, because if you're kind of in between and you're not really spilling over into the full psychedelic effects, then it can just be confusing. Whereas if you go all the way into it, paradoxically, it actually starts to make more sense because you can understand more of sort of the energetic space that you're in.
100%.
But another experience that came up like shortly after that was the same 2 friends and I did some mushrooms again. And this was back home in Chico in Northern California. And when the mushrooms were coming on, my 2 friends wanted to go to 7-Eleven. And I was like, I'm not getting in the car with anybody. You can go to 7-Eleven if you want. And my friend was really into like heavy dub reggae music at that point. So he just left me alone in his apartment, and this really heavy dub is playing. And I'm feeling it all coming on. I was like, whoa, okay, this is going to be big.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was really curious is I was looking at just a white wall, just a plain white wall. And I started to see all these geometric designs that were essentially interlaced Celtic knots and like Celtic artwork and design.
Yeah.
And that was really fascinating to me because it just kind of clicked like, oh, maybe this is what, all these different cultures mean when they're talking about the quote unquote spirit world, that they're talking about like this kind of thing. And, maybe the ancient Celts, maybe they were eating mushrooms because they made art that looked like all this stuff. And I'm seeing all this stuff like right now. I mean, it looks exactly like that. And kind of opened up sort of that idea that actually we're accessing, like one person's interpretation might be, which is definitely not mine, would be like, oh, well, you were like a Celtic shaman in a past life or something like that. And so you're like seeing that. And my opinion at the time was, no, I'm just seeing the same things that they would have seen, that these are artifacts of the mushroom experience. And we also see it with like Mesoamerican art. That's a big theme that I visually see on mushrooms, and I think a lot of other people do as well. And it's not because any of us are tapping into Mesoamerican culture or spirits or the afterlife or anything like that. It's just they were eating mushrooms and creating art, and this is just what it looks like when this is your source of visual material.
100%.
Yeah, so kind of that idea that, oh, well, I'm actually interacting with my mind in different ways where like that little sparkle on the wall, I feel like I can talk to it, but I didn't turn over to, well, I believe that the sparkle on the wall actually has agency and consciousness and is communicating with me, but it's a part of myself that I've displaced to over there on the wall. And now I'm interacting with it. So even at the time, I didn't have the language for it, but I was kind of a proto non-dualist at that point, but didn't have the educational background to articulate it in that way.
100%. Yeah, exactly the same experience here. I was seeing those Central American, Mayan and Aztec type patterns are just on my genes. Just, there, it's right there in my hand, It's like, wow, I've seen that before, and I've had this discussion on my pod as well about how, I started to speculate almost with an agnostic tip that maybe I just saw this on Discovery Channel and maybe that's why it's there. And maybe it's not that I'm tapping into the same thing that the Mayans and the Aztecs did. But, after all of the experiences I've had since that point, and all the conversations I've had since that point, I really do think that we are touching into the collective psyche and that, altered state experience that the same people have been accessing for all of time. And really, it would be the most interesting thing to the point you would make the art like out of stone and carve it and create these pyramids, because back then there was no Netflix and no Hulu and nothing really to do except explore these inner realms. It was like, I'm looking forward to the next mushroom journey, like that was their daily life, for the shaman and for, the people that were doing that as well, which certainly wasn't everyone. But I do like to think it was more people than less people, or at least about half, like you feel like the warriors, and this seems to be true through a lot of these ancient cultures, like the Vikings, and the like the Bhagavad Gita and their warrior story, like coming into contact with Krishna, and the warriors from these Central American tribes as well get some type of initiation. So much so that they've even put it in the movie Avatar. I think it was removed, but there's like on YouTube, there's like an ayahuasca initiation for these warriors, So I think that's been a trope, and people have been using these medicines for a long time and reaching those realms. And it's just really affirming to hear so many other people share the same story. And that's what I love about this, is making a little home for people like ourselves, like on the podcast. But so I know I want to get into, because there's a lot to go here, with the 5-MeO and where it can go, like even so much further beyond these kind of even lower level visionary experiences. So after having and gaining your understanding of the base level psychedelics, how does DMT and 5-MeO DMT and these type of things start coming into your life?
Yeah, so all of that was really much, much later. So, after having these initial mushroom experiences that at that point I started trying to find whatever literature I could about these kinds of subjects, and started, investigating shamanism, and reading anthropological materials and looking at how different cultures have used these. And what came up next was actually wasn't until after graduate school. So yeah, all the way through this whole time period of being a college student and then a graduate student, it's basically just cannabis and mushrooms. Those were my only psychedelic experiences at all. And then it was after completing graduate school that there was a newspaper article in the LA Times, and it was about this guy, Daniel Siebert, who had this website, Sage Wisdom, where you could, get this Salvia Divinorum thing, which I had read about, learning about the Mazatec cultures in Central America. And so I just, reading this newspaper, and I was like, oh, this is awesome. So I got online, and sure enough, could just order it from his website. And I got some enhanced leaf Salvia Divinorum, and then started experimenting with that. And that was both reminiscent of mushrooms and also completely and totally different. And that became sort of my baseline for a very rapid, all-encompassing, at the time I called it a psychedelic tsunami. You smoke this enhanced leaf Salvia Divinorum, and within seconds, it's like this tsunami just completely overtakes you. Right. And I worked with that for a number of years with Salvia, and was really quite the Salvia fan, which most people are not, because it's a weird one. And so all of that was kind of in my mix. And then it wasn't until 2006 is when I'll just got to move some books, but I'll grab it here. I published this book, Mushroom Wisdom. So this is a book about psilocybin mushrooms. And anyway, as the story goes, is this guy out in the desert in California is like, hey man, I really want a copy of your book, but I don't have any money. Can I trade you some stuff for it? I was like, oh, okay. So he ended up sending me some yopo seeds, and he gave me instructions for, how to prepare the yopo seeds. And so I always do like to mention that was my first experience with 5-MeO-DMT, is through these yopo seeds. Right. And I always like to also make the distinction that my first quote unquote full experience with 5-MeO-DMT came several years later, or a couple years later. It was actually in the beginning of 2008, and that was with pure freebase 5-MeO-DMT. And so I experimented some with these yopo seeds, and there was definitely something going on there, but compared to Salvia Divinorum was not all that notable. And then even after I moved up here to Ashland, Oregon, with the person who ended up serving me 5-MeO-DMT, he had invited me over to try some Bufo alvarius secretions. And that was also a rather small dose. So even from that, my comparison to Salvia Divinorum was like, Salvia Divinorum kicks this thing's ass, man. Yeah. That was not all that interesting compared to what Salvia does. Sure. And so then it was in January of 2008, that's when I got to experience what 5-MeO-DMT really, truly has the potential to do. And it was just so far beyond any previous psychedelic experience I had ever had, and also presented as, this is the exact experience I've been looking for my entire life, but didn't know that this was what I was looking for, and basically answered all my questions about the nature of being, the nature of reality, the nature of God, the nature of consciousness, the true nature of identity, how the ego functions in the human body. I mean, it just laid it all out. So, sometimes with 5-MeO-DMT, we like to talk about the ontological shock that occurs. And I definitely went through that. It was like, wow, this is really it. This is something else. And so just became a huge fan and proponent of 5-MeO-DMT at that point.
Would you mind describing, while we're on this this big release dose, the sensations that were occurring, and how long did it take to get from in your body to out there, and how long were you out there before you came back, and what happened out there, you know?
Yeah. Well, okay. So, people who follow, or however you want to put it, my material online, they've heard me tell this story like many times, but I'll go ahead and I'll tell it again.
Thank you, brother.
So the 5-MeO was served in an argon gas vaporizer.
Okay.
And it had this glass chamber that had a little piston or a little stopper up at the top. And so the chamber is filled with argon gas. And the reason for that is that it's a inert noble gas. And so you can heat up the 5-MeO DMT and it turns to vapor and none of it will burn, because there's no oxygen, so that you can't chemically burn. Mm-hmm. So this whole chamber was filled with this milky white vapor. And I took in the hit, and I got about 2/3 of the way through the hit.
Okay.
And at that point, as I'm still inhaling, I could tell, like, oh shit, this is it. Which, my prior 5-MeO experiences were not like that. I mean, this was like, oh my God. And within a matter of seconds, I thought, okay, I've really done it now because I think I'm dying. And it was, so it was this ego death experience where it just felt like everything is dissolving. Everything is turning into this crystalline, fractal white light. So visually, what's opening up before me is like this mandala of white light with rainbow refracted edges and just this perfect sense of symmetry. And it's like this starlight that I described as like living starlight it was light that was conscious and aware, and it was made out of the energy of unconditional love. And so in this moment of perceiving like I'm dying, and it felt like I'm going to just be absorbed into this totality and I'm never coming back. And I was in a place where I just had this profound sense of yes within myself. Just yes, let's go for it. Let's let it happen. And, within seconds, the first thing I said was just, thank you, God. Thank you. Yep. Thank you. And I was just in this state of gratitude and reverence, but my ego was dissolving away. So actually the thank you just kind of became like this mantra that I wasn't saying it to anyone. It was just wave after wave of like this ecstatic, orgasmic gratitude that was just in every single molecule of my being, and just this vibration of just absolute unconditional love. And it was the most beautiful, complete experience I ever could have possibly had. And my mind was also recognizing like, oh my God, this not only is this quote unquote God, this is this universal consciousness that everyone and everything is actually made up of. This is the only thing that actually exists. And that means it's also me, because it is me performing as this person known as Martin, who's not here anymore. And so I'm actually looking in a mirror, that this is a self-reflective moment. And so I was that being. And I knew that I had always been that being. But as the character of Martin, I might have believed that or not believed that or thought that or not thought that. And this was just so obvious. It was just the most obvious thing that ever could possibly be. Is like, no, this is the nature of reality. This is what it is. There is one universal consciousness and being whose ultimate energy is the pure energy of unconditional love. And this energy then splits itself off into apparent divide of subject and object, and animate object and inanimate object. And the entire evolution of the universe is this energy interacting with itself in order to evolve more capable, more sentient versions of itself, like human beings, that can then interact with itself and also have a separate identity. So it was just wave after wave of this. And this was maybe 10, 15 minutes completely in that absorbed state. And then there was a very distinct point where I started to notice that like the first layer of what I would identify as Martin kind of came back on. And one of the ways that manifested is that, my eyes were wide open. And within seconds, the entire room, everything had dissolved into this white light. But then eventually I noticed, like, oh, there's a human form over there. And there's another human form. And that's when I started to realize, oh yeah, I'm a human form too. It's like, oh, that one's male and that one's female. Oh yeah, and I'm a male. Oh yeah, and the name Martin goes with this one, and that one is Hal, and that one's Maya. And so layer by layer, everything started to recoalesce. And then within about 30 to 40 minutes, everything was back down to baseline, back down to zero. And I had returned from the experience and was just completely ecstatic, because it was just the overwhelming impression that, like, okay, that was it. That was the absolute nature of reality. And there really isn't anything to explore beyond that, because there is nothing beyond that, because that was everything all at once.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. When you have that experience, it's almost like, this is why I was born.
Yeah.
To understand this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, and how lucky, because how many people have come and gone and never experienced it?
Yeah. That's also when, pretty much from that first experience, that I essentially became somewhat of an evangelist for 5-MeO DMT, because at the time, almost no one had heard of it. Pretty much whenever I tried to talk about it, people would say, you mean DMT? I was like, no, I'm not talking about DMT. I'm talking about 5-MeO DMT. So people didn't even know what it was. They didn't know that it was different from DMT. And also,
I get that all the time. I'll hear people talking about, like, that was a crazy DMT trip I heard about on your podcast. And I was like, no, that's 5-MeO DMT. And they're like, oh, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, these are really, really different from each other. And also at the time, nobody really was talking about the unitary nature of being. No one was articulating a non-dual perspective within the psychedelic space. Everybody wanted to talk about spirits and aliens and UFOs and past lives and just all of this stuff that is highly, highly dualistic. And just coming out of this, like, I think everybody's kind of missed the point that, like, I don't think most people have really gotten there yet, that they don't understand that beyond all these projections of duality, there is this profound state of unitary being. So I started to, really try and educate people about this. And there was just so much pushback and anger. I even got emails from people saying, oh, you're a total fraud, you're a charlatan because you think 5-MeO DMT is so powerful. And people were really leaning very heavily on Terence McKenna at the time. And they were like, well, Terence McKenna said it was just a feeling. And I was like, yeah, and he totally missed it. He doesn't even get what it really is, apparently. So there was a lot of resistance to that. And also just using the word God, people would come back and it's like, oh, you're talking about Christianity or Judaism or Islam or something. It's like, no, that's a completely mythological notion of what God is, that I'm talking about something quite different, but I'm also intentionally using that word because I want to get the point across. And that's also the point when I nicknamed 5-MeO DMT the God molecule, because I wanted people to understand, everybody was calling DMT the spirit molecule, talking about all these spirits and, going into the afterlife and, communicating with all these spirits. And I said, okay, well, if we want to call that the spirit molecule, then we should call 5-MeO DMT the God molecule, because that kind of is a shorthand encapsulation of how much more powerful this is and what level of awareness it can take you to very, very rapidly. So I became a big proponent of 5-MeO DMT and wanting to make sure that anybody who desires that level of experience, that they would get education around it and also hopefully access to it, and try to talk about it as, I think that this is our most fundamental right as a human being, that we have a right to know that actually we are that thing, that beingness.
Yep, 100%. Well, I just want to say thank you, man, for not getting dissuaded by the negative emails and the pushback, because it's difficult. It's difficult. That's not a fun time, but at the same time, you've really created such a body of work and shared so much knowledge that, people like myself, I've heard probably 10 hours or more of your stuff, and I can't get enough of it. So I just want to say thank you, man, from one psychonaut to another for staying true to the mission. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying so.
Absolutely. So there's a number of topics I want to jump into right here, but my first one is, why does this toad have this medicine? Is it, because my assumption is the Sonoran, what's it called? Sonoran desert toad? Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that it more or less it's trying to kill an attacker. Let's call it a snake. A snake's trying to eat the toad. It explodes this venom out and pretty much knocks the snake off its feet, and it's given up now, and he's crawling out of the mouth and he's leaving. But the snake is going to wake up too. He's not dead, but he definitely thought he was. Is it just chance and evolution that this toxin does that? And then it's another crazy story. I'm sure a bunch of people are a fan of Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, where he actually goes and finds out who smoked this thing first. That's a crazy story. But in your opinion, why do you think the toad carries this venom, this medicine, whatever it is?
Yeah. Ultimately, it's just one of these freak developments in nature. I think that there's no particular reason. I mean, it's an interesting question because all toads everywhere in the world, they create tryptamines that are secreted through their protective glands that they have on their bodies. So all toads produce various tryptamines. The primary tryptamine that every toad in the world makes is 5-HO-DMT, which is also bufotenine. And, the quote unquote higher animals that have a brain and have a nervous system, that tryptamines can either function as neurotoxins, such as bufotenine, or they can function as neurotransmitters. And so when a predator comes up to a toad and they secrete this stuff, if it gets in the mouth of the predator, then it will have a physiological and psychological effect on that predator. And it functions rather quickly. And it's also just kind of nasty tasting, or, so somebody bites down and I was like, and then, I'm fucking tripping. Like the toad gets away. So it's this protective thing. And the interesting question that, we can't really answer is, well, why does the Sonoran desert toad, also known as the Colorado River toad, why does only this one toad in the entire world, it also produces 5-HO-DMT, it produces bufotenine, but in addition to that, it produces 5-MeO-DMT. So why this toad and no other toads? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. I do have a friend who says that he thinks it's because they spend like 9 months out of the year in sort of a suspended animation, where they're hibernating inside the mud, or really the dried earth in, Arizona and northern Mexico. And then when the monsoon rains come in the spring, that's when they come out and, start hopping around and reproducing and stuff. And he thinks that it's because they're hibernating for so long, that somehow they turn either melatonin, which is also a tryptamine, very closely related to 5-MeO-DMT and DMT and all the rest of these, or perhaps converts the bufotenine into 5-MeO-DMT. But I mean, that's just a friend who's speculating. He's not a herpetologist. He doesn't know anything about the the biological pathways within toads or anything like that. So no one really knows why this one toad produces that. But just from an evolutionary perspective, it's just that the only thing that we can say is that these secretions are protective for the toad, that it helps them get away from predators. But why this one produces 5-MeO-DMT, but just happens to be the most profound and powerful psychedelic molecule that exists in reality, why does it make it and none others do? Who knows? Who knows? And,
Right.
then there's people on the spiritual side of things who want to say, well, it's the spirit of the toad that wants to bring us all to a state of enlightenment. And that's just the kind of stuff that is like, well, okay, metaphysical speculation, that's fine.
Sure.
Yeah, but I'm not into that myself.
Totally. Yeah. It definitely feels like an Easter egg. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when you learn about Easter eggs in films or even in video games, it's like it's too good to be an accident. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But who knows? Who knows? I'm grateful it does, and I really do hope that these organizations can really help to preserve the safety of these toads, because we've known through the last decade that the numbers dwindled for quite a while. I'm not certain where they are now, but I know that people have started to protect them more aggressively, which I am grateful for. So that's definitely wild. And then just the idea of thinking like who in their right mind would go and milk that toad and smoke it and to find out what happened. Like that just seems nuts to me. Like what do you know about that story, if anything?
Yeah, I don't really know many of the details of that. I would imagine that probably, I think the name is Albert Most. I think that's the name on the pamphlet that was written, but I think the person's actual name is something else.
That's right, yeah.
But
I found him in a later season in the Hamilton documentary.
Yeah, so I would imagine that he probably had some knowledge of chemistry, and 5-MeO-DMT had already been identified as this tryptamine. Because there was a lot of research done in the earlier part of the last century after the discovery of mescaline and psilocybin, that a lot of people were, and also LSD, a lot of the chemists were looking at, well, what are other potential psychedelic neurotransmitters? And it had already been identified as existing within human beings as well as DMT. And biologists learned that actually all mammals contain DMT and 5-MeO-DMT. So I would guess that he had probably been exposed to this information, and then, the psychedelic program of the bioassay, right? So it's like, okay, well, they say that it contains this psychoactive tryptamine, but we don't know what it does because nobody's really tried it yet. So that the bioassay means I'm going to ingest it, or I'm going to smoke it, or vaporize it, or, I'm going to take it into my body so I can find out what it actually does. And, there are other cultures in the world that don't use toad venom, but, for example, in India and Nepal, there are lineages of shamans and holy people who have used like cobra venom, other things that would be identified as poisons. Then, of course, we have like henbane, mandrake, and nightshade, which can be poisonous, and datura and brugmansia, which also can be poisonous. So human beings have kind of been experimenting with where's the line between tripping and poisoning myself for millennia. Sure. And so there's lots of substances that have been used that don't work in the classical psychedelic sense that most people are more familiar with, but that, are just kind of riding that line between, if you take too much, you're going to die. And if you take the right amount, you're going to have some kind of, phenomenal experience.
Right.
So yeah, he probably just wanted to see like, okay, let's give this a try. This is a tryptamine. Let's see what it does. And there are other places where 5-MeO-DMT can be found in the natural world, but it's hard to get sufficient concentration of the 5-MeO-DMT to really have a powerful experience. And so that's the bioavailability of 5-MeO-DMT in toad secretions is fairly high, and so it's fairly consistent. And I also like to point out that synthetic lab-made 5-MeO-DMT is perfectly effective. There is no need for anyone to bother the toads and to gather their secretions and use them and disrupt them in their habitat. Many people like that because it, quote unquote, comes from nature, and they like that it pleases them. But stuff that comes from a lab is just as effective. So there are other ways to get your 5-MeO. And there are various plants that also do produce it, but those are tricky because you either have to create an extraction process, or with like yopo seeds, you have to snort a bunch of these seeds up your nose, which for me is not particularly a pleasant experience of having a bunch of crushed seeds up my nose. So Bufo is easier in that respect. But it's not the only place you can get it. It's not the only vehicle through which 5-MeO DMT can be gathered and administered.
Right. And to your knowledge, is 5-MeO possible to generate within the body endogenously?
Yeah, so this is something that's been known, since the 1960s or 1970s, that all human beings have trace amounts of 5-MeO DMT and DMT inside their bodies, and that it's part of our nervous system. It's in there. There is various speculation about, is it made in the pineal gland or is it made in the lungs? I don't think anybody's really fully identified like where it comes from in the body. And it is this open question of, are there time periods where we can produce more of it? And, so there's lots of people who do like darkness meditation retreats, and they say, this will produce DMT and 5-MeO DMT. And I don't think anybody has actually scientifically investigated that. That's the impression that people have, but it might not be correct. Right. And I have certainly gone through many of experiences where it has felt like I have just taken a hit of 5-MeO DMT. Right. And even so from that first experience in 2008, I went through this really profound process of kind of energetically recalibrating that came to a point of conclusion in the spring of 2009. And at that point, it essentially felt like I was tripping 5-MeO DMT to one level or another for about the next 3 months.
I remember that.
Yeah,
that's crazy. I mean, it's such a powerful experience, and I've had a number of tastes of it. I might still not have had a full release dose, but I'm kind of okay with it because I look at the psychedelic staircase, one step at a time, and it's going to give me what I need. I've had probably 3 or 4 experiences with 5-MeO, but I've always been just very wary to not overdo it. But I definitely am getting the message, you know what I mean? And the message to me feels like something that has definitely been tapped into through ancient cultures, and how they come to know these higher states of consciousness. What is samadhi? What is beyond samadhi? These states of oneness, states of enlightenment, states of, Godhead realization that it's all one. There's plenty of stories of, famous yogis or mystics who go off into a cave, or maybe they're sitting by a river, or whatever the case may be. They have this experience of, I know now that we're all God. I know now that it's all one, that the seed of consciousness within me is the same transmission from the same source as everything is receiving, from the ant to, my mom to whoever, my enemy or whoever it might be. So it makes me wonder that unless there was some way to access 5-MeO in the ancient culture, these people may have been inducing it endogenously. And that experience may be responsible for the most widely accepted wisdom traditions, things like probably more like the Vedas than Buddhism. But still, that experience of enlightenment that Buddha had is very reminiscent of these psychedelic understandings. As well, the whole Sikh faith and Ekankar, which means the creation and the creator are one. And then yoga, just general yoga, it's really about union with the divine, merging yourself, merging the smaller you with the larger you. All of this stuff, I don't know. It makes me think that 5-MeO And if it's not 5-MeO, it might just be an NDMT. But I don't know. After the 5-MeO experience, it seems to nail it home a little better. So
Yeah.
what does this bring up for you?
Yeah. Well, there is a rather undeveloped part of religious studies that is referred to as neurotheology. And it's kind of looking at this question of what is going on neurologically when people have different spiritual and religious experiences. And part of that, if it isn't, it definitely should include this idea of when people are in deep unitive non-dual states, can we measure and see, does their body have a higher level or concentration of 5-MeO DMT in them at that time? I think that if we were to look at like people who claim to have lots of visionary states of consciousness, that is more the descriptor of DMT, which tends to be very visual and still resides within the dualistic separation between subject and object. I am in some space seeing really weird shit. Okay, that's still duality versus I recognize myself as identical with the universal consciousness that is everyone and everything, and there is no subject and object. That is more in alignment with the 5-MeO DMT experience. And as we do know, as we've already covered, that human bodies and actually all mammals do produce these molecules. But it is a question of, is there a correlation between these deep spiritual experiences or religious experiences that people are having, and there's an addition of production of that within the body? Like when I went through that time period of like tripping 5-MeO for like 3 months, from my own subjective experience, I could taste it in my mouth. My wife said that my sweat smelled like 5-MeO DMT. I mean, it certainly seemed like my body was producing an excess of it at the time. Now, I didn't do a blood draw. I didn't have anybody like analyze my plasma or anything. But I think it's a very interesting question that, all living beings are basically chemical factories, that we go through these different catalytic processes of producing different chemicals, and the human body can take a base tryptamine and can turn it into serotonin, it can turn it into melatonin, it can turn it into DMT, it can turn it into 5-MeO DMT. So we have the biological hardware in order to do this. And I think it's a very interesting question to look at how the human body might be producing this stuff and correlating with these experiences. And also, it's very important to recognize that, so I was a religious studies graduate student. And back then, there wasn't any class that covered like entheogens and religious experience. Entheogens only came up a couple different times in some of my classes, but it wasn't something that was really addressed. But, that was back in the late 90s. Early in the late 90s is when I was a graduate student. And at this point, we now have pretty conclusive evidence from around the world that most of these religious traditions, that actually people were doing all of this stuff, that in Buddhism and in Hinduism, there's Amrita and Soma, which is undoubtedly some kind of psychedelic mix. It's been used in Jainism. We can see it in Zoroastrian religion. We can see it in Judaism. There's been aspects within Christianity and also within Islam. So all of these religious traditions that claim all of these powerful religious experiences, actually, they've been using psychedelics for a long time, but it's all been super top secret, that this is the kind of stuff that you had to be initiated into in order to have that shared. Also in ancient Greek culture, I mean, like Greek philosophy starts to make a lot more sense if you understand that most likely they were tripping. So when, they're talking about the Platonic forms and, these complex geometries out of which the shapes of the physical world emanate, it's like, well, they were tripping. They were seeing this stuff.
Right.
So it's really embedded within the human experience that we've been using these things for as long as we've been exploring what it means to be human and articulating that. And kind of going back to something that you said before, that I think a lot of, particularly the sacred architecture from around the world, it comes out of things that people have seen in their visionary experiences. And they're like, well, I'm going to build that thing. because that was
Right.
really cool. And so that's why we get to quote unquote see sacred architecture on psychedelics, is because that's where the blueprints come from in the first place. And then also the art and the music and the mythology, it all originates in these kinds of things. So people have been at this for a very, very long time. We just haven't been really aware that that's where all of this stuff is actually originating and coming from.
Yeah, I agree. This is just pure speculation, but I do almost feel like it's possible that some animals that have since become extinct, or even plants that have gone, missing off the face of the planet, may have been around back then and had 5-MeO. Maybe there was a certain plant or a certain snake or a certain other toad that produced that. Of course, pure speculation, but I like to put it out there. Maybe someone else can look pretty deep into it if they hear the podcast and like that idea. But that only makes sense because it's probably not the desert's, Soren desert toad. They didn't come the Vedas didn't travel over to Colorado to get their medicine, but I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that there's anything there, or could there be extinct plants or animals that could have carried that and they would have had access to it?
I would say that's within the realm of potential, but, possibly way back in time. A lot of plants that produce DMT also do produce 5-MeO DMT. It's just usually in lesser concentrations. And I think something that is particularly special about, both Greek culture and also Indian culture is that the philosophers and the mystics and, the holy people, they were interested in the question of what lies beyond the form and the appearance of subject and object. So they had essentially a non-dual focus that was already there. And I do like to say that like 99% of all psychedelic experiences are still residing within the realm of duality, of me and not me and what I'm seeing or what I'm experiencing. But, we can see that there are time periods within people's dualistic psychedelic experiences where they do occasionally spill over into a non-dual experience. It's a bit rare. It does tend to be rather brief, so somebody might say, like, I had a 6-hour mushroom journey and there was like 30 seconds in there was like, oh my God, it's the totality. Like, this is it.
That's happened to me.
This is the reality beyond subject and object. So it's not like 5-MeO DMT is the only catalyst that spills over into the non-dual experience. It's just much more effective and much more likely for it to happen through the vehicle of 5-MeO DMT. But it is possible through these other psychedelic states to reach into that. And so I think that it's important that these ancient traditions, they weren't just getting stuck in the spirit model of, okay, well, there's all these spirits and entities in all these different realms, but they kept pushing the question, like, what's beyond that? What's beyond that? And that's where the non-dual unitive experience lies. And this is where we do see a bit of a difference in more traditional, like, shamanic cultures, where they're living in relationship with their local ecology and their local plants and animals, and also then in the visionary realm with spirits and entities, that the shamanic model still is mostly rather dualistic, that it says, okay, there's good spirits and there's bad spirits, there's friendly ones, there's unfriendly ones, there's good energies and there's bad energies, and it's all about reciprocity, exchange, and relationship. And I think that was very effective for a lot of these cultures. But I think that they didn't necessarily push into, well, what's beyond all of that? Because this is the thing, is that from an evolutionary perspective, it's not really functional. It doesn't really contribute to the well-being of the local tribe, because at the well-being of the local tribe, you do want to know, where can we find the right animals? Where can we find the right plants? What do we need to eat? What can we use as medicine? Versus in these cultures that developed, beyond just the tribal stage, and they're now into complex societies that have complex economic, social, and political and religious systems that they're kind of pushing into. Okay, well, what's beyond everything? What is the nature of the absolute? And so I think the focus was a little bit different, and therefore, this is one of the things about these experiences, that if you're not really committed to, I want to get to the truth of being, you generally won't get there. Or if you do get there, it'll be brief and you might not recognize it for what it is. So there is kind of this idea of this commitment to the absolute nature of being, that you'll be more likely to discover it if you have that commitment. And this is not a criticism or judgment of shamanic cultures. I'm just saying that from a functional standpoint, that wasn't really an effective question for them. And also, a lot of these cultures that did go into the non-dual, they're developed to a degree where someone can spend their life meditating and contemplating this, and society doesn't collapse. But if you live in a small scale tribal culture, if like Joe is just sitting off to the side and meditating all the time, it's like, I'm to discover the secrets to the true nature of being. Everyone else is like, dude, we've got hunting to do. We've got some fishing to do. We've got to gather some medicines. We've got to make the community house so we can have our ceremonies. In other words, you've got to be contributing to the day-to-day survival of an indigenous culture, a tribal culture. Whereas in these larger scale societies, there's the luxury of having people who can just meditate for 50 years and then say, I found it. I found the answer. And so it's just not really functional from that standpoint.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well said. That does lead me to the idea that, what is the link with these non-dual states and 5-MeO, with the psyche, with synchronicity, and also with time? Because in these states, it can almost be like we can see the future, or we get a sense that the future's already been written, and we're just like backwards in time on a record player that has already, like the full record's already been written. We're just in the groove over here right now, but the whole thing's there. You know what I mean? Like, it's really hard to put into words. But synchronicities seem to be where you're almost like feeling into a place that you're supposed to be, and you almost knew you would be. You just didn't know how to say it. And you arrive at a place and you'll be like, it would be like this. This would be the result of all of those past experiences. We could even call it destiny, like, were you destined to have that 5-MeO DMT trip? And when you get to these states, they're so ineffable. They're so beyond comprehension and time as well. It's almost like you step beyond the dimensions of space and time, and you can look back at them. I'm very curious, what do you think about the relation to 5-MeO, the psyche, maybe our own individual journey, but also like just space and time, and has it all happened? And are we just in this matrix right now,
Yeah. Well, it's always important to recognize that when we're dealing with that state of awareness in and of itself, it's only something that can be experienced directly. And that everything that we ever might say of it or try and articulate about it is still happening within the realm of duality, that every word implies both a speaker and a hearer. So every word we say is trapped within duality. And also every word is related to either sense impressions or concepts or ideas. And so words that we use are ways that we divide the experience of reality into subjects and objects and verbs and ideas. And the value of having the direct experience is that when you're there, it just presents as the suchness of being. Mm-hmm. And so it's immediately and intuitively recognized in that moment. But then there's always a transition into that and there's a transition out of that. And the ego can be very active at both of those stages. It's like, whoa, what's going on here? How do I make sense of this? Like, how do I talk about this? This sense of totality where there is no subject and object. It's just the suchness of being, that in that moment, there's only awe. But then as we come down out of it, it's like, well, how do I talk about that? And how do I make sense of it? How do I communicate it? And so then people might say, well, yeah, it felt like I could see the future. And then I've, plenty of other people have told me that they feel like they see all possible permutations of the past. And you get this opportunity where you look at and you see like everything in my past actually brought me to the point where I am now. And so there is that sense of destiny, like, oh, I've been brought to this. But then you can also look and see that, well, look, any moment, if you really look honestly at any moment, you realize, oh yeah, obviously everything that ever happened before brought me to this moment right now. But this moment is just like really, really mundane. So I'm not thinking of it that way, versus the moment where you're in the depth of the 5-MeO experience that's anything but mundane. It's extraordinary. Right. And so it feels as, this profound cosmic religious revelation in that moment. And we, it's even with the thing with synchronicities, that we tend to think about things that we notice that we think are meaningful, and we don't register the things that we don't mark out as meaningful or significant. Like one of the things that has been very curious in the past 20 years or so, I'm old enough that I lived back in a time when clocks had hands on them. And fucking nobody played, in my opinion, the stupid magic time game. Nobody ever did that. Nobody said, oh, it's 1:11 right now. Whoa, it's like the angel time. Or it's 11:11 and 11 seconds. Like, whoa. And it's like, look, analog clocks have been replaced by digital clocks. And you don't even think about it when you look at the clock and it says, oh, it's 2:19. We're like, oh, who cares about 2:19? But if it's like 2:22, it's like, oh, whoa. It's like, oh, that means something.
Right.
And this is the thing, is that the ego, and that this is functional. I mean, this works well, but the ego is a meaning addict. The ego wants everything to mean something. It is very satisfying to the ego when shit means something. And so all meaning is essentially invented by the human ego. I mean, animals don't go around asking like, oh, it's 11:11. What does that mean? It's like, that's totally irrelevant. The animal is thinking food, water, sex, shelter. But human beings are constantly taking the input of their experience and then trying to organize it into meaningful events and meaningful stories and narratives. So that's just where, when it comes down to it, I like to say, look, it's all just a big game. Okay. God is playing a game with itself, because on the other hand, see, the human ego is a meaning addict, but God, as this unitary consciousness that doesn't have anything else to do, is kind of an experience addict, in the sense that, look, I'm just going to incarnate myself into billions of beings all at once and have them all interact with each other. And some of it's going to be great, and some of it's going to be like really terrible and lots of suffering and pain and anguish. But that one being is kind of is an experience addict, that all space and time is the construct that is necessary in order for this being to have an experience of not being itself, so that it can forget who it is and like really invest in the story of its individuated existence. So we've got this constant input of experience that's happening, which happens whether or not we are aware of it, because that is the nature of reality, is this ongoing experience. And then we have this meaning addict that rides on top of that, that's trying to always make meaning and understand everything. And it's a big satisfaction for the human ego to think that it really understands something, because then it feels like it has some form of control over it. And so, yeah, when, honestly, when people talk about destiny or meaning or purpose, that's where I like to just take a step back and just say, let's stick with what we really know. What we really know is this is my experience. right now. The meaning I make of it is probably a story that I'm telling myself. And so how do I just be present with myself and live in a way that's authentic and genuine? That for me, that's where I like to steer people back towards. But, certainly I've been there. I've had like, whoa, this is the most meaningful thing that's ever happened to me. And it seems like my whole life is actually guiding me towards this moment. And that's what a lot of people say about 5-MeO. But, I always could have chosen not to take the hit. So I don't think it was like destined. That I do believe that we as individual agents do have a modicum of free will, that I don't think that everything is set in stone in that sense.
Right. So to debate just a little bit, I wanted to say that, if it is an ego doing that meaning making, would we call it the spiritual ego? Because we know that the majority of the humans out there aren't seeing synchronicity. They don't even know what that word means. To people like you and I who've been in the spiritual path for years, we were oversaturated. We're like, everyone's talking about it, But like to most people, they've never really tied in with what synchronicity is. So to me, it feels like a path that I'm uncovering that isn't so clear, that I have to work to understand what it means. It isn't just, there I go again, making a big deal out of nothing, It's like, wow, so I really dug deep and something was revealed. And that something that was revealed resonates on a soul level more than just like the mat mind. It's like, I couldn't have even asked for this. It's a gift. It's a gift from the divine, a gift from God. What does that bring up for you?
Yeah, well, that's the nature of existence, that every moment is a gift from God. Every occurrence is a gift from God. And, again, that we as individuated versions of this universal being, that we do tend to parcel things out into what I like versus what I don't like, what I want versus what I don't want. So when something good comes our way, we're like, oh, wow, I've been gifted. But we're just as much gifted when something bad comes our way. It's like, because we go back to the experience addict side. It's like, yeah, but this is experience, right? So the nature of experience is the gift itself. That without these embodied vehicles to walk around in, there's no interface to have experience. That we need these bodies to have this experience. And that comes with stuff that we would decide is good and stuff that we would decide is bad, stuff that we would decide is meaningless and random, and stuff that we would decide is very meaningful and significant. And I always do like to remind people that I tell them, like, look, all of reality is one being interacting with itself. So of course, weird, uncanny stuff is going to happen. It's like, whoa, how could that even be? And it's just the way it is, but I don't want to make too much meaning out of it. So I'll give you an example. And I talked about this in a previous talk that I gave somewhere. So maybe people have heard this before. But anyway, this was a couple years ago. I had just completed working on my album, Temples of Light. And my plan for that evening was I'm going to take some MDMA. I'm going to listen to my new album on my headphones. I'm just going to go through it a couple times and just really vibe in and see how I feel about it.
Sounds like a great night.
Yeah. And the very last song would not properly bounce. So I work on Mac. It wouldn't bounce down properly from Logic into iTunes and then magically transfer over to my phone. It would not get off my computer. And so I even tried like uploading the song to like Google Drive and Dropbox and then re-downloading it and see if it would, automatically populate, and it wouldn't work. And I tried uploading it to my Bandcamp page and then downloading, and all of that worked and I could play it on the computer, but it would not properly transfer to any of my other devices. And my plan had been to get my headphones on and lie down in bed and have this experience. So what I instead opted for was just playing it on the computer and lying down in my living room or in my office and listening to it that way. Anyway, I'm listening to this album, having a great time, and I listened to it 3 times. And then on the 3rd time through, on that last song, there was something that had been bugging me about it, but I hadn't really figured it out yet. But on the last time I was listening to it, And I was listening to that last song, and the last song on the album has this little piano riff that the song is built around. And what occurred to me is that on the last note of that piano riff, I hit the key too hard. And it's like, that note is too loud.
The velocity is high, yeah.
Yeah. And when I realized that, it was like this complete epiphany, because I was like, fuck, that's it. If I change that note, the song is going to work. It's going to bounce down. It's going to show up on my phone. That somehow the song is resisting because the song knows that it's not right, which is a weird way to think. But at the time, it was like, this is it. And I was also like cracking up, because I was like, this is too fucking weird. If this is really the problem, this is too funny. This is really, really funny.
Right.
And by God, but I was convinced, like, okay, this is going to do it. So I get in, I open up Logic, I find the note, I take the slider, take the velocity down from 100 to 80. I bounce the song down. Instantly, it shows up on my phone.
Exactly. And I've had 100 of those.
Yeah. So that's like a weird experience. Like, technologically speaking, that should not have made any kind of difference whatsoever.
Right.
But for some reason it did. That's all I can say. And, I could look for investing a lot of meaning into it or whatever, but that's where I like the story. Just like, this is one of the freaky things that has happened to me. Like this weird tiny detail that somehow made all the difference. And then when I caught it, it's like, I knew what the outcome was going to be. I knew this was going to work. But beyond that, it's just like, reality is made up a bunch of stuff like that. So we can look for that, enjoy it when you catch it. But everything, actually, every moment is an opportunity to realize, like, oh, it's actually all just me. And I don't mean the egoic, individuated person. I mean the unitary consciousness that we are. It's like, kind of, it's being revealed in every single moment, and it's just up to us to pay attention to it. And then you see it everywhere, and it's obvious. Like, oh, that's how it works. Okay.
Totally. I love that. Great story. I love that story. And again, I've had a number of experiences like that, where it's just like, how did I get this intuition that then solved the problem? And that thing didn't want to happen that way. It wanted to happen another way. It wanted to be improved.
Yeah.
Getting some crazy light right now, but it's all right. So the last part of this, before we move into integration, because I think that's a big part of this, I definitely want to tap into, is just, do you believe in the concept of karma?
Okay. Short answer, no, not even close. Because karma, first of all, this is a word that's been adopted into Western culture, and it's just been kind of uncritically adopted, this idea of karma. But if we go into Indian culture, we actually find that not only does every different religion in India have a different definition for karma and what it is and where it comes from and how it works, but even the sub-traditions within all those different religious traditions. So there's actually many different versions of karma. It's not even one singular concept in Indian culture. So it's kind of vague to ask, like, what do you believe in it? Because it has to, like, well, are you talking about like Hinayana Buddhist karma? Are you talking about Mahayana Buddhist karma? Are you talking about Advaita Vedanta? Are you talking about, are you talking about the Krishna version of karma? Which version are you talking about? And what is similar with all of them is that karma is understood as what results in you being reborn into another life. And this also is terribly problematic, because from a genuine non-dual perspective, the whole concept of individuated reincarnation makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The whole notion that there are souls actually also makes no sense. And this is a place where I feel that Buddhism has actually really failed, because Buddhism rejected the notion of a soul. But I think that the concept of reincarnation and karma was so intimately ingrained into the presuppositions of the Indian worldview that even though the Buddha taught souls don't exist, they're not real, that the concepts of reincarnation and karma have been reinforced within Buddhism, even though it like logically does not make any sense at all. Like even right here, I've got this book from my friend Mike Crowley, Psychedelic Buddhism, and he's a Lama in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. And even in the book, he writes that the biggest problem with the Buddhist concept of karma and reincarnation is that they believe in it. Because it actually doesn't make any sense. So karma, again, there's so many different definitions of what karma is and how it's accumulated and what it does, and that what happens. Also, all these different religions from India, they have completely different stories about what happens when you get rid of karma. So they have completely different endings to the story. It's like choose your own adventure. But if we just settle with the basic idea that karma is what drives the process of reincarnation, I have thoroughly rejected the notion of reincarnation at an individual level. That here my catchphrase is the only one who reincarnates is God. And God is already everyone and everything right now, and is every being that ever was and is ever being that ever will be. And that's me and it's you. That we're all, in that sense, we're all reincarnating all the time, but there's no part of Martin or whatever makes Martin, that doesn't reincarnate. So there's nothing that's held over from one life to the next. There's nothing fueling this metaphysical speculative process that takes place. So yeah, I'm pretty firm on that no, I don't believe in karma.
Okay. Well, I don't know if maybe my term is being defined differently, but for example, there's big internet memes about like instant karma, where someone does a bad thing and then they get taken out. You know what I mean? It's like instant karma.
Yeah,
it's like,
which is a Western reinterpretation of the word karma, which has nothing whatsoever to do with where the concept originates from. Karma does not ever impact your current life. Karma is what determines the conditions of your next birth. That's what karma does. So
in this example, you in that example of karma, you would have had a good last life to the point that you were born as Martin.
Yeah.
And you are going to have an elevated life where you're going to merge with God now.
Yeah.
Because you've earned it.
Yeah.
And you've done a lot of good work over the past reincarnations. I think that's the thing, personally. Maybe I'm still in the lower levels of consciousness. I'm not sure. But I feel like, why are you so lucky? Why would you have that experience? Because again, as I said at the beginning, how many millions of people have been born and died and never once merged with God?
Yeah.
Other than maybe during death. But
okay. The best and only explanation that I can give for it at the quote unquote cosmic level would be, look, it's kind of like asking, why did lightning strike over here and not over here? And the answer is, well, actually there's these little tendrils of energy that reach up from the earth, and that's where lightning connects, and wherever that connection is strongest, that's where the lightning strikes. And so my personality structure was such that I was one of those tendrils that was reaching out. And it just so happened that it came at just the right time in my life where I was able to say, yes, let's do it. So in that sense, it just got lucky. I mean, it doesn't mean like I've been prepping for this for, countless lifetimes or anything like that. It's like, look, it's just, I had the right personality structure and had the right sense of trust and surrender in the moment that I was able to have this experience and let it completely reorganize my sense of self and reality. And so I was just a prime candidate. That's all that it is. And it doesn't, it's not because I'm a better person than anybody else. It's not because I was chosen. It's not because it was my destiny. It's like, I was just a good candidate and I got lucky. And that's why I do like to say that those kinds of experiences on 5-MeO DMT, it's an experience of grace. It's like the best definition that I could give for it is like, you got lucky. And it doesn't mean anything beyond the fact that you're at the right place in the right time with the right vehicle and it happened. And that for other people, it might not happen. And, that's just what it comes down to. So,
well, I'll just say that I saw this just yesterday. It's just an internet meme. I'm not trying to mark it all up to this big, perfect answer, but the internet meme said, it's never luck, it's always God.
well, yeah. But I mean, so is bad luck, so is good luck. I mean, everything. That's the thing, is that everything is God all the time.
Love it. Okay. I think we hit that pretty good. Thank you for going back and forth with me on that.
Yeah.
Before we run out of time, we've had these experiences. We realize it's all one. We realize there is something so much greater. What do we do with that? A lot of people I know, they have a tough time integrating it. They have these reactivations where they can't sleep at night, and it's almost like, oh, this is too much. This is too much for me. Like, I can't even integrate it. Like, I almost wish it didn't happen. Some people, a lot of people are like so grateful, but I know you've probably talked about this a bunch, but how would you sum up that? Like, what do we do with this energy now that we know?
Yeah. So we don't have time to really get into all of it, because I do have to run shortly to go pick up my son from school. But the short answer is, okay, so that if you had the full experience, you have now had the most intense experience of the true energy of being that you could ever have. Okay. So now you know what truth feels like. Okay. Now, as an individuated personal expression of that energy, your job is now to pay attention to, when am I being authentic and truthful with my energy? And when am I indulging? When am I deceiving? When am I lying to myself? When am I projecting? When am I being attached? When am I trying to make something into something else versus just being present with how I genuinely am and allowing myself to embody and express that? So I do say that the ultimate integration is to learn how to just be authentically who and what you are. You are God embodied as a human being, and that being is a being of energy. Everything that we would ever experience is a form of energy. But so often we have an energy that says, oh, I want to do that. And then another part of it says, oh, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or don't say it that way, or, do it like this, and then other people will like you more, or put it that way and you'll be more accepted. And so there's all different kinds of ways that we edit ourselves, we censor ourselves. And then we also pick that up from society. It says, no, don't be that way, be this way. We go against our natural inclinations of who we are as energetic beings. And it's all inhibited by the self-concept that we've generated, which is a collection of patterns of energy that regulate how we interpret and express our experience. And we call that the ego. And we've become identified with it. And so the ego itself becomes a form of prison that we trap ourselves in. And by completely going beyond the ego and seeing our unlimited, liberated potential, then it's about, how do I embody that more fully as the limited individual that I am, in the little tiny window that I have that is my life, and in the little tiny areas that I have that I can express myself and allow myself to be. That it ultimately comes down to, we and we alone are responsible for our own liberated being and our own liberated life. God's not going to do it for us. Buddha's not going to do it for us. Jesus isn't going to do it for us. Donald fucking Trump isn't going to do it for us. Nobody's going to do it for us. If we want to be liberated and be authentic in our being, it's up to us. And the power of 5-MeO-DMT is that it gives you the opportunity to go through what I call the energetic recalibration process. And so it's not about singular events. It's not about, wow, I had that big event. Like, what do I do with that now? It's like, well, actually, let's see where you can be more authentic in your life. Let's see if you can find that place of pure unconditional love for yourself, and turn it on yourself and then also turn it outside, because the self actually is both of these things. And then learn to live from that place, to love and accept yourself for who you are and give yourself permission to be who and what you are as you are, free from any concept of what you think you should be or have to be or ought to be for either yourself or for God or for Jesus or for your political party or for anyone or anything else. It is a place of radical liberation done by the self for the self. And that integration process is complex, and that really, to advise people, it does take getting to know their life story of what has impacted them, where have they made choices about who they are and what they feel they deserve, and how they embody their ability to express themselves and love themselves. And then looking at what actually energetically showed up for them within their experience. Did they barf all over themselves? Did they scream and yell? Did they try and run away? Did they contort themselves into a pretzel? Did they do handstands and flips? Did they vibrate in orgasmic ecstasy for 20 minutes? Did they look around the room? Did they clench their hands? Did they open their hands? You know, there's so many different ways of helping people to get an accurate look of where they are at energetically, and then help them find a place of more authentic embodiment and expression. But it's very individuated, that you have to really just work at one person at a time. And I definitely don't take a cookie cutter approach to it.
Totally. Makes a lot of sense, man. Definitely appreciate it. Love that. And I really love just your note about self-love. You know, I think that's been one of the biggest learning experiences from myself with psychedelics, is being able to see myself as a being worthy of my own love too. You know what I mean? Because we always have to feel like we have to win something, we have to achieve something, we have to be greater to earn that self-respect, that self-love. But it should always be there. And the more you practice it, the more those other things will come, I think personally.
Yeah. And really, I'll just end with this, and I do got to run because I got to go get my boy. But the key is, the self-love is actually effortless when you find it, because that is the genuine energy of being. That any attempt to love yourself is like you trying. And the less we try, the more we just relax into what is, and we find, oh, well, that's just the way everything is, actually. That self-love, that's what actually exists. That's why all of this grand theater takes place. This is all an expression of self-love, because the only one God has to do it for is itself. So that is the most fundamental energy of being. And it's effortless because that's just what exists. So I like to try and help people find that within themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Martin. It's been an honor having you today, man. That's Martin Ball, guys. Go check out his work. I'm going to link to his stuff down below in the bio. And yeah, it was an honor talking, man. And I hope to speak again. Great meeting you. And thanks again for your time today.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah, absolutely.